In Pororua, Jerry Collins was a hero and will continue to be so, perhaps more so after his funeral this week. I'm told he was a great All Black, though if you'd been on the receiving end of his smashing runs, you might not agree. He has been given a hero's farewell. TV1 News devoted the first 8 minutes of its 6 o'clock show to his tragic death in France. It was the next most important item to the weather. I don't understand it. I really don't understand why a sport that is only played really well in half a dozen countries continues to define us. May Jerry and Alana rest in peace. And I don't understand this morning's gospel either, all about another hero who stopped a storm in its tracks. I wish I didn't have to preach on it, especially to a congregation like this one, full of critical and discerning people who pride themselves on not having religious wool pulled over their eyes. But even smart people need heroes. And this is clearly a hero story. The closest parallel I can find in Aotearoa to the gospel reading is not Jerry Collins, but Hipa Te Maiharoa, a Ngāi Tahu prophet who in 1879 led a hikoi down the Waitaki Valley to protest the fraudulent land grab of the New Zealand Company. And in the course of that hikoi, Te Maiharoa was reported to have stopped a steam train in its tracks as it crossed the Waitaki Road Rail Bridge. That will be distressing to the train buffs in the congregation, but it was reliably reported in the Oamaru Mail, which at the time was at least as reliable as the New Zealand Herald is today. Now, you may have questions about this piece of history, but the way Te Maiharoa's epic life has been immortalized is nothing compared to what we have done with Jesus. In our attempts as a church from the very beginning to try to express who this man is for us. We can call him the Son of God, and for many Christians then and now, that is enough. Even though the title is a metaphor, the easiest way to deal with metaphors is to nail them down and give them a literal meaning, preferably only one meaning, and then you can get on with your life. No more questions. It's all clear. So much for the magic of poetry. So much for the mystery of faith. Once you allow metaphors to open up, though, to provoke more questions than answers, then you have to deal with the floodgate that you open. And in this case, it's more than a flood, it's a whole storm at sea. Storms on the Sea of Galilee were violent affairs just as scary as the ones out there in the Tasman. And that's because demons were at work, as they had been since the first morning of creation. The waters of the deep held the spirits of evil and chaos, and only God could control them. So when Jesus says to the storm, "Be still," his words literally mean, "Be muzzled, you demons." And the Old Testament, especially the Psalms, are full of references to water management on a divine scale. "Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck," says Psalm 69. "Don't let the deep swallow me up, or the pit of hell close its mouth over me." And in the Exodus story, Moses invokes God to perform the ultimate miracle, which is not only to calm an angry sea, but to turn it into a safe bridge where the people of Israel can walk across with dry feet. And the greatest blessing a person can enjoy is to lie down in peace and take my rest. For it is you alone, O God, who can let me lie down in safety. And that's what Jesus does in this story. He goes to sleep, even in the midst of a storm. And when he's woken up, he calms the storm, and no doubt his disciples slept well that night. For a first century audience, you couldn't find a story more compelling than this one to reassure people that God is still in charge and that this representative of God, this son, prophet, rabbi, healer, call him what you will, is authentic. But does it work for us? We who still seek reassurance of a God who is present and alive and active in our midst. Miracles that change the weather, and we could do with some of them. Miracles that stop trains in an instant. Auckland Transport needs none of them. These kind of miracles don't have the same resonance for postmodern urbanites and technocrats like us. We can do things on our cell phones that would make us appear godlike to a first century audience. But our need for evidence of God's presence and God's action is as strong as ever, and the hunger for reassurance does not go away, especially as a church. Because this is a story about church. From the very start, it's been read like that. The boat is the early symbol of Christian community, which is why the ecumenical movement adopted the sailboat as its logo, with the cross as a mast. And it's why we sit inside buildings like this one in the nave, in the Navy, inside the hull of an upturned boat. Tip the church over and we could all sail away together. And the church in this story is very anxious about its future. The followers inside the boat are so scared they can't cope. And what's more, they're getting tired and old, and they don't have the resources to manage, and the task before them is overwhelming, and they're about to be swamped, and no one is taking any notice of them. No one's listening. God does not care enough to intervene. Now, where have you heard all that before? Maybe the story is not so out of date after all. We worry about the future of the church. We look at the average age of our congregations, our declining market share. We look at the way we are distorted by the media, or even worse, ignored by the media, and we wonder whether we'll be around in 50 years or be swamped by the sea of post-modernity. And the disciples, the first disciples, were just as anxious. But they knew who to trust, who to turn to. The roles they expected Jesus to play were varied and sometimes confusing. Some of them wanted a Jesus who would do everything for them. Others wanted a political leader, a revolutionary zealot who would get rid of the Romans, a freedom fighter, a nationalist. For others, they wanted a guru, someone in the wisdom tradition. And for others, they wanted a kind of code maker and code breaker, the man with the passwords for health and healing, who could unlock the secrets, the sort of secrets that Dan Brown writes novels about. An old-fashioned miracle worker was what most people wanted Jesus to be, bigger and brighter than all the other miracle workers around, and there were lots of them. Someone who could instantly feed not 5, but 5,000 people and calm a whole sea with a single word. Now, we can scoff, but we dress Jesus in the clothing of our need just as much. We transform him from judge and general to therapist and friend of little children above the bright blue sky. We sing about him as scarred victim and scapegoat on a cross. We portray him as a Maori chief walking on the waters of Lake Rotorua, as a blonde, blue-eyed Lutheran who could play quarterback in American football, or maybe even as a Samoan All Black. Or on the cover of a book of feminist essays published in Christchurch in the 1990s, as a crucified woman. We know how to make Jesus in our own image. And every time we do that, we bring him closer to us. We incarnate him in our world, in the world we know. And that lets us meet him afresh, up close and personal. But at the very same time we do that, we run the risk of distancing Jesus if the image doesn't suit us, if we don't play football, for example. And getting captured by some of these roles, the miracle worker, for example, we may well end up reducing Jesus, closing him down rather than opening him up, and allowing ourselves to be open to him. By making Jesus magical, we risk shrinking him, underestimating him. The church's job is not only to retell the old stories, but to keep translating them, to tap their potency and their power. So, if Jesus' calming storms works for you, good on you. If it helps you to enter into the mystery of God, go for it. But if it doesn't, then look elsewhere for different expressions of the same figure, playing different roles, revealing different faces of God's mystery. And we've got plenty to choose from in our New Zealand heritage of faith. James K. Baxter was a fine theologian and one of our greatest poets. He designed his metaphors not to be tied down, but to explode in a kaleidoscope of meaning and provocation. Jesus, for Baxter, was not a figure defined by some magical action, some one-off miracle. He was not a hero for Baxter, certainly not in any all-black mode. Jesus for Baxter was a poor man who took the form of an outcast, who gave a bad smell in the noses of the righteous and the smug, a wanderer blowing like the Spirit across 1,000 paddocks, singing his song in the hearts of the poor, guiding us, wounding us, healing us. A fire who does not cease to burn, consuming us with flames of love and peace, driving us out like sparks to set the world on fire. Like the sun in the sky, Baxter wrote, the light shining in our darkness so that we ourselves can become the light. Now that's a Jesus I can follow. That's a Jesus who will lead me into the heart of God. So whatever image you have of him, whichever one you choose to trust, don't settle for anything less than that. In Jesus' name we dare to say these things. Amen.